You won't believe how a simple tree cutting turned my quiet weekend into a showdown with the HOA, the police, and a golf cart parked in the worst possible spot. Stick around because this story has a twist you'll never see coming. You won't believe what happened the day I decided to cut down a tree by the lake. The sun was shining, birds were singing, and I was ready to finally get rid of that old half-dead pine tree that had been blocking my view for years. I grabbed my chainsaw, put on my safety goggles, and got to work. The roar of the chainsaw echoed across the water, and I felt a rush of satisfaction as the branches started to fall. Little did I know, this simple act was about to turn my peaceful Saturday into a full-blown neighborhood drama. I had been eyeing that tree for months. Every time I sat on my porch, hoping to catch a glimpse of the lake, that scraggly pine stood right in the way, its needles dropping everywhere and its trunk leaning more and more each season. I'd even checked with a couple of neighbors, and they agreed it was an eyesore. So, after a quick breakfast, I decided today was the day. I pulled on my work gloves, fired up the chainsaw, and started cutting away the lower branches. The smell of fresh pine filled the air, and I was already imagining how much better the view would be once the tree was gone. As I worked, I noticed a few people walking their dogs along the path by the lake, glancing over curiously. I waved, and most of them smiled and waved back. It felt good to be doing something productive, something that would improve not just my own property, but the whole lakeside view. I was careful to keep the area clean, stacking the branches neatly and making sure nothing fell into the water. I even had a tarp laid out to catch the smaller twigs and pine cones. About halfway through, I took a break to wipe the sweat from my forehead and admire the progress. The sun was higher in the sky now, and the lake sparkled in the light. I could already see more of the water, and I felt a sense of accomplishment. I was just about to get back to work when I heard the familiar hum of a golf cart engine. I turned around and saw the HOA president, Mrs. Thompson, coming down the path, her face set in a look of determination. She pulled up right next to my driveway, hopped out, and marched over with her clipboard in hand. "Excuse me," she said, her voice sharp. "Do you have a permit for that?" I explained that the tree was on my property, and that it was dying anyway. I even pointed out the brown needles and the cracked trunk. But Mrs. Thompson wasn't interested in explanations. She started lecturing me about HOA rules, saying that any changes to landscaping near the lake required written approval from the board. I tried to reason with her, but she just shook her head and pulled out her phone. Within minutes, she was calling the police, telling them there was a major violation happening by the lake. I couldn't believe it. I was just trying to clean up my yard, and now the cops were being called? I stood there, chainsaw in hand, feeling a mix of frustration and disbelief. A few neighbors had gathered by now, watching the scene unfold. Some of them looked sympathetic, while others just seemed entertained by the drama. About 15 minutes later, a police car pulled up, lights flashing. 2 officers got out and walked over, looking a little confused. I calmly explained the situation, showing them the dying tree and the mess of fallen branches. The officers listened, nodded, and then turned to Mrs. Thompson, asking her to clarify what the emergency was. She launched into a long explanation about HOA rules and community standards, but the officers didn't seem too impressed. That's when I noticed something ironic. The HOA's golf cart, the one Mrs. Thompson had driven down, was parked right in front of a big, bold "no parking" sign, blocking the emergency access path to the lake. The officers noticed too, and one of them pointed it out. Mrs. Thompson tried to explain, but the officer just shook his head and started writing a ticket for the illegally parked golf cart. In the end, the police told me I was free to go, as long as I cleaned up the mess and maybe planted a new tree in the next few months. Mrs. Thompson, on the other hand, had to deal with a fine and a lot of explaining to do at the next HOA meeting. As I finished cleaning up, I couldn't help but smile. Sometimes life has a funny way of turning the tables, and that day by the lake was one I'll never forget. Just as I was hauling away the last of the branches, I heard the unmistakable whirring of a golf cart engine. It was the HOA patrol, and they looked more serious than ever. The president, Mrs. Thompson, hopped out, clipboard in hand, and marched straight toward me. "Do you have a permit for that?" she demanded, her voice sharp enough to cut through steel. I explained that the tree was on my property and was dying anyway, but she wasn't having it. Within minutes, she was on her phone, calling the cops and telling them there was a major violation by the lake. I couldn't believe it. Over a tree. I stood there, sweaty and covered in sawdust, trying to process what was happening. Mrs. Thompson's face was set in a look of pure determination, the kind you only see on people who take their HOA duties a little too seriously. She started scribbling furiously on her clipboard, muttering about community standards and unauthorized landscaping. I tried to stay calm, explaining again that the tree was half dead, leaning dangerously, and that I'd even checked with a couple of neighbors before starting. But she wasn't interested in my side of the story. To her, rules were rules and I had broken them. As she dialed the police, I could hear her giving a dramatic play-by-play. "Yes, officer, there's a resident here cutting down a tree without approval. It's right by the lake, and it's a major violation of our HOA guidelines. We need someone here immediately." She made it sound like I was committing some kind of environmental crime, not just cleaning up my own yard. I glanced around, hoping for some support, and noticed a few neighbors had started to gather at a safe distance, watching the scene unfold like it was the latest episode of their favorite reality show. One neighbor, Mr. Jenkins, gave me a sympathetic shrug. He'd had his own run-ins with the HOA before, and I could tell he was glad it wasn't him this time. Another neighbor, Mrs. Patel, whispered to her friend, "All this over a tree? Really?" But no one dared to step in. Mrs. Thompson had a reputation for being relentless, and nobody wanted to get on her bad side. While we waited for the police, Mrs. Thompson continued her inspection, walking around the stump and taking photos from every angle. She even measured the distance from the tree to the water, as if she was gathering evidence for a court case. I tried to keep my cool, but inside I was fuming. I'd lived in this neighborhood for years, always paid my dues, and never caused any trouble. Now suddenly I was being treated like a criminal for trying to improve my property. The minutes dragged on and the crowd grew. Some people were clearly enjoying the drama, while others looked uncomfortable. I could hear snippets of conversation. "Did you hear what happened to the Smiths last year? I bet the HOA is going to fine him big time. I wonder if the cops will actually do anything." It was like the whole neighborhood had come out to watch the showdown. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the police arrived. 2 officers stepped out of their car, looking a little bewildered by the scene. Mrs. Thompson rushed over to them, waving her clipboard and launching into a passionate explanation of the major violation she had witnessed. She pointed at the stump, the branches, and then at me, as if she was presenting the evidence in a high-profile trial. The officers listened patiently, nodding as she spoke. When she finished, they turned to me and asked for my side of the story. I explained everything, how the tree was dying, how it was on my property, and how I'd taken every precaution to make sure the removal was safe and clean. I even showed them the photos I'd taken of the tree's condition before I started. The officers seemed to understand, and one of them even commented that it looked like the tree really did need to come down. Mrs. Thompson, however, wasn't satisfied. She insisted that the rules were clear. Any changes to landscaping near the lake required written approval from the HOA board. She demanded that the officers issue me a citation, or at least make me stop what I was doing. The officers exchanged a glance, clearly trying to figure out how to handle the situation without making it worse. In the end, they told Mrs. Thompson that this was a civil matter, not a criminal one, and that it would be up to the HOA to resolve it. They advised me to check the community guidelines and maybe plant a new tree to replace the old one just to keep the peace. Mrs. Thompson was not happy with this outcome, but there wasn't much she could do. As the police left and the crowd began to disperse, I couldn't help but shake my head at the absurdity of it all. All I wanted was a better view of the lake, but instead I got a front row seat to the power of HOA politics. And as I finished hauling away the last of the branches, I realized that in this neighborhood, even the simplest projects could turn into the biggest dramas. About 15 minutes later, 2 police officers pulled up, lights flashing. They stepped out looking a little confused. I calmly explained the situation, showing them the rotting trunk and the mess of fallen branches. The officers listened, nodded, and then asked Mrs. Thompson where exactly the problem was. That's when I noticed something hilarious. The HOA's golf cart was parked right in front of a big, bold "no parking" sign, blocking the emergency access path to the lake. The officers noticed too, and their eyebrows shot up. The moment was almost surreal. Here I was standing in my yard, covered in sawdust and sweat, trying to defend myself for cutting down a dying tree. while the supposed enforcers of the neighborhood rules had just broken one of the most important ones themselves. The irony was almost too much to handle. I tried to keep a straight face, but I could see a few of my neighbors, who had gathered to watch the spectacle, exchanging amused glances. The officers, still trying to piece together what was going on, turned to Mrs. Thompson. She was in full HOA president mode, waving her clipboard and pointing at the remains of the tree. "This resident has cut down a tree without proper authorization," she declared, her voice echoing across the quiet lakefront. "This is a clear violation of our community guidelines. We have strict rules about landscaping, especially near the water. He didn't submit a request, didn't wait for approval, and now he's ruined the view for everyone." I could see the officers trying to keep their composure. One of them, Officer Ramirez, asked, "Ma'am, can you show us exactly where the violation occurred?" Mrs. Thompson led them over to the stump, explaining in excruciating detail how the tree had been there for decades, and how its removal would destabilize the ecosystem. She even pulled out a folder of printed emails and HOA meeting minutes, as if she was presenting evidence in a courtroom. While she was busy making her case, the other officer, Officer Lee, wandered over to the golf cart. He looked at the no parking sign, then at the cart, then back at the sign. He pulled out his notepad and started writing something down. A few of the neighbors started whispering, and I could see more than one phone pointed in the direction of the cart, recording the moment for posterity. Mrs. Thompson, oblivious to what was happening behind her, continued her tirade. "We can't have residents just doing whatever they want," she insisted. "If everyone started cutting down trees, this place would look like a wasteland." She turned to me, her eyes narrowed. "You need to be held accountable for your actions." Officer Ramirez nodded politely, then said, "We understand your concerns, ma'am. But from what we can see, the tree was on his property, and it appears to have been dead or dying. There's no evidence of malicious intent or damage to public property." He turned to me and asked, "Did you notify the HOA before starting the work?" I explained as calmly as I could that I had spoken to a couple of neighbors and checked the guidelines, but I hadn't realized I needed written approval for a tree that was clearly a hazard. I even showed them photos I'd taken of the tree's cracked trunk and brown needles. Officer Ramirez nodded again, jotting down a few notes. That's when Officer Lee walked back over, holding the notepad. "Ma'am," he said to Mrs. Thompson, "is this your golf cart?" She looked confused for a moment, then nodded. "Yes, it is." "Why?" Officer Lee pointed to the sign. "You're parked in a no parking zone. This area is reserved for emergency vehicles and must remain clear at all times. Blocking this access could be a serious safety issue." The look on Mrs. Thompson's face was priceless. She opened her mouth to protest, but Officer Lee was already writing a citation. "I'm going to have to issue a ticket," he said. "We take emergency access very seriously, especially near the lake." The crowd of neighbors couldn't help themselves. There were a few stifled laughs and even a couple of claps. Mrs. Thompson, red-faced and flustered, tried to argue, but the officers stood firm. "We appreciate your concern for the community," Officer Ramirez said. "But everyone has to follow the rules, including the HOA." In the end, the officers told me to make sure I cleaned up the debris, and suggested I plant a new tree in the future to keep the area looking nice. They handed Mrs. Thompson her ticket and reminded her to move the golf cart immediately. As the police left and the neighbors began to disperse, I couldn't help but feel a sense of poetic justice. The very person who had tried to get me in trouble for a minor infraction had ended up breaking a much more important rule herself. That day, the story of the HOA president's golf cart spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. People still talk about it whenever they see her driving by, and I learned that sometimes karma really does come around, especially when you least expect it. The officers turned to Mrs. Thompson and asked, "Is that your golf cart?" For a moment, she looked like a deer caught in headlights. Her mouth opened and closed as she tried to find the right words. "Well, yes, but I was just doing my duty as HOA president," she finally managed, her voice suddenly much less confident than it had been just moments before. She glanced at the growing crowd of neighbors, clearly hoping for some support, but all she got were a few raised eyebrows and some barely concealed smirks. The officers, however, weren't buying it. Officer Lee, the taller of the two, pointed directly at the bold red and white no parking sign. "Ma'am, This area is clearly marked as emergency access only. It needs to be kept clear at all times in case first responders need to get through. Blocking it is a serious violation, much more significant than removing a dying tree from private property. His tone was calm but firm, and it was obvious he wasn't going to let this slide. Mrs. Thompson's face went through a rapid transformation. Just minutes earlier, she had been the picture of authority, clipboard in hand, voice sharp, ready to enforce every rule in the book. Now her cheeks flushed a deep red, and she started to fumble with her words. I didn't mean to block anything. I just needed to check on the situation. I was only going to be here for a minute, she stammered, her eyes darting nervously between the officers and the crowd. But Officer Lee was already pulling out his ticket book. Intent doesn't change the fact that you're parked illegally, he said, flipping to a fresh page. We have to treat everyone equally when it comes to safety regulations. If an ambulance or fire truck needed to get through, this cart would be in the way. He began writing out the citation, his pen scratching loudly in the sudden silence. The look on Mrs. Thompson's face was absolutely priceless. She went from furious to flustered in a matter of seconds. Her earlier confidence had completely evaporated, replaced by a kind of stunned disbelief. She tried one last time to plead her case, her voice barely above a whisper. Can't you just give me a warning? I'm the HOA president. I was only trying to enforce the rules. Officer Ramirez, the other officer, shook his head. We appreciate your dedication to the community, ma'am. But the rules apply to everyone. Emergency access is non-negotiable. He handed her the ticket, and for a moment Mrs. Thompson just stared at it, as if she couldn't quite believe what was happening. Meanwhile, the neighbors who had gathered to watch the drama unfold could barely contain themselves. Some started whispering to each other, and a few even giggled openly. I caught the eye of Mr. Jenkins, who gave me a thumbs up and a wink. Mrs. Patel, who had been quietly watching from her porch, let out a little chuckle. The tension that had filled the air just moments before seemed to melt away, replaced by a sense of shared amusement. It was as if the entire neighborhood had been waiting for this moment. A little bit of poetic justice for all the times Mrs. Thompson had come down hard on residents for minor infractions. Now here she was, caught red-handed breaking a much more important rule. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Mrs. Thompson, still holding the ticket, finally seemed to realize she wasn't going to talk her way out of this one. She muttered something under her breath, marched over to the golf cart and climbed in. As she started the engine, the crowd parted to let her through, some people still snickering as she drove away. The officers watched her go, then turned back to me. Officer Lee gave me a reassuring nod. Just make sure you clean up the debris and, if possible, plant a new tree in the next few months. We're not here to make life difficult for anyone, but we do have to enforce the rules that matter. I thanked him, feeling a wave of relief wash over me. As the officers left and the neighbors began to disperse, the story of what had just happened started to spread like wildfire. People were already pulling out their phones, texting friends and family about the day the HOA president got a taste of her own medicine. For weeks afterward, whenever I saw Mrs. Thompson, she avoided eye contact and drove her golf cart a little more carefully. That day, I learned that sometimes the universe has a way of balancing things out. The person who tried to make an example out of me ended up being the one who got called out in front of the whole neighborhood. And as for the rest of us, we got a story we'd be laughing about for years to come. In the end, the police told me I was free to go, as long as I cleaned up the mess and planted a new tree in the next few months. Mrs. Thompson, on the other hand, had to deal with a hefty fine and a lot of explaining to do at the next HOA meeting. The best part? The story spread like wildfire through the neighborhood, and people still laugh about the day the HOA called the cops, only to get busted themselves. Now, every time I look out at the lake, I remember that sometimes a little bit of irony is the best revenge. And as for Mrs. Thompson, let's just say she's a lot more careful about where she parks her golf cart these days. As the police officers packed up and left, the crowd of neighbors that had gathered slowly began to disperse, but not before a few of them came over to pat me on the back or offer a sympathetic smile. Some even whispered, "Good for you," or about time someone stood up to her. It was clear that Mrs. Thompson's reputation for strict rule enforcement had rubbed more than a few people the wrong way over the years. Now, seeing her get a taste of her own medicine was almost a cause for celebration. I finished cleaning up the last of the branches, feeling lighter than I had in months. The old, dying tree was gone, the view of the lake was better than ever, and the air seemed to buzz with a new sense of camaraderie among the neighbors. People who had barely spoken to each other before were now chatting and laughing about the day's events. It was as if Mrs. Thompson's downfall had brought the whole community together, if only for a little while. Later that evening, as the sun set over the lake, I sat on my porch and watched the water shimmer in the fading light. I couldn't help but replay the day's events in my mind. The absurdity of it all, the chainsaw, the HOA patrol, the police, and finally the ticket for the golf cart, felt almost like something out of a sitcom. I realized that sometimes the universe has a way of balancing things out, even if it takes a little while. Over the next few days, the story spread like wildfire. It seemed like everyone in the neighborhood had heard about what happened, and the details grew more dramatic with each retelling. Some said Mrs. Thompson had tried to argue with the police for half an hour. Others claimed she had threatened to call the mayor. The truth, of course, was a little less dramatic, but no less satisfying. The important thing was that people were talking, and for once the conversation wasn't about who had the greenest lawn or the straightest mailbox. At the next HOA meeting, attendance was higher than it had been in years. People showed up early, eager to see how Mrs. Thompson would handle the fallout. She walked in, her usual air of authority noticeably diminished. She tried to carry on as if nothing had happened, but the whispers and sideways glances made it clear that things had changed. When the topic of parking violations came up, someone in the back coughed loudly and muttered, "Golf cart," sending a ripple of laughter through the room. Mrs. Thompson's cheeks turned red, but she didn't say a word. After that, things in the neighborhood seemed to shift. The HOA was still strict, but there was a new sense of fairness. Rules were enforced, but with a little more understanding and a lot less drama. Mrs. Thompson herself became more approachable, even stopping to chat with neighbors she used to ignore. And as for her golf cart, she never parked it anywhere near a no parking sign again. In fact, she seemed to go out of her way to follow every rule to the letter, perhaps hoping to avoid another public spectacle. As for me, I kept my promise to the police and planted a new tree by the lake. This time I made sure to fill out all the necessary forms and get written approval from the HOA. The new tree is small now, but every time I water it, I remember the day the neighborhood came together over a little bit of irony and a whole lot of laughter. Looking back, I realized that what started as a simple attempt to improve my view turned into something much bigger. It was a reminder that sometimes, standing up for yourself is worth the trouble, especially when you know you're in the right. And sometimes the best revenge isn't anger or confrontation. It's a good story, a better view, and the knowledge that even the strictest rule enforcers have to play by the rules too. So now whenever I look out at the lake I smile. Not just because the view is better, but because I know that sometimes life has a way of working out just right. And as for Mrs. Thompson, well, let's just say she's a lot more careful these days, and the rest of us are too. If you enjoyed this wild HOA story, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe for more unbelievable neighborhood tales, and ring the bell so you never miss an update. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.